Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. Our American friend TJ is on the FaceTime, and let's see what she's got to ask us this week. TJ?
Hey Dale, we are in Ottawa, almost out of lockdown. Word on the street, so that's promising.
For a couple weeks.
Speaking of, I've been reading a lot of things in various international outlets, including the BBC, about scandalous and searing evaluations of the Canadian vaccine rollout and surprised praise of the American vaccine rollout. And yet I feel like there's a bit of an apples to oranges situation going on here. And I'd love to know a bit more about what you think that maybe some of the fallacies of comparison are happening, both in terms of who is in charge of that actual rollout and therefore who's accountable, as well in terms of states, provinces, and federally, and as well as, how is the reporting potentially harming the actual understanding of the comparison?
Right. Okay, small topic. Okay.
Baby.
So I think, first of all, one of the things we need to consider is, it's a lot of it is procurement. And Canada does not have sufficient domestic capacity to make our own. This is long-standing. This has been the problem of governments for the last 3 decades, probably in the making, the slow abandonment of most of this capacity from our country.
And for the American friends of mine who listen to you,
yeah.
When you say it's the last 3 governments, that means the last 3 groups that have held power?
I would say it's more than just the past 3 governments. It's about the past 3 decades and the various governments over them. So both liberal and conservative, of whichever conservative.
Across the timeline.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because there were a couple of different conservative configurations in there. So this is a long-standing issue. And not to mention the fact that most of the vaccines that we're contracted for are these mRNA ones, and there's no capacity to manufacture this in Canada, even if we had the existing or the old lab space capacity that we used to have.
Old meaning what does the used to have context?
So back in we had this one called Connaught Labs, which is a Crown Corporation funded. They did I think it was the polio vaccine, and so this was like a huge undertaking that got sold off in the 80s, got privatized. It eventually closed, and then over the last 15, 20 years, more and more of these kinds of facilities that were in the country closed down. In part because we had governments that didn't really care enough about it, but it was also just, I think, the way in which the global economy was changing, and you could have capacities, outsourcing and economies of scale and so on and so on. So early on, when we started trying to contract for different vaccine candidates.
So this is, what timeline are we talking here? When was the government making this initiative to try to contract for vaccine outlets?
It would have been...
What quarter are we talking here?
So this would have been around July, August.
Okay.
So this is when we finally had an idea of which candidates were actually in the running at this point. Because before that, they hadn't even completed enough trials or anything like that with any of the candidates. So when we started seriously looking at them, we offered different companies the ability to try and produce them here with what capacity we did have. And based on what the minister in charge has said, was that these companies basically all said, there's not enough capacity, and there's not enough of a population in Canada to make it worthwhile to build the capacity and get the expertise necessary.
Well, yeah, it's quite a complicated formula when you look at it, right? You look at your overall population, you look at the time to market for any of these things, and you look at the investment to market, right? And you look at that against the per capita
Yeah.
of the expenditure of the government. It's a deeply complex evaluation, which I think is underreported, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
But please continue, yeah.
And so this is so at that point we are basically beholden to these facilities that manufacture them abroad, and because of American protectionism under Trump, there was very little chance that we were going to be able to get any of these vaccines from American facilities.
That's interesting. So
So
there's an actual trade.
yeah,
And all of the trade elements, I've heard a lot, and one has learned a lot about the trade negotiations in North America between Mexico, Canada, and the United States under the Trump administration, but that this then therefore carried over into actual vaccine. That vaccines were pulled under the trade agreement, which is fascinating, right? Because one thinks of it as a public health matter, but actually, at the end of the day, it's a good.
yeah, yeah. And so knowing that we weren't going to be able to get them from the Americans, we had to contract them from mostly European facilities. And then on top of that, the Pfizer facility needed to retool in order to scale up their production.
Retool in terms of actual technical capacity.
Yeah.
So that's like a straight up warehouse, like with laboratory
Assembly lines, so on and so on.
Yeah.
So they needed to retool one of their production lines so that they can make more of them faster. So that cut into the number of doses that they were sending out. And then the Moderna one, they are having supply chain issues with their facility. So
Which that phrase, I think that a lot of people who were never familiar with it before have become familiar with it during COVID. The concept of supply chain issues.
Yeah.
And it's not just toilet paper, right? Like
Yeah.
it actually comes down to.
yeah, and there is actually a Canadian company that is in the supply chain for Moderna, and they're making components of this vaccine in Canada and being sent to the European facility for integration. But
Interesting.
it's
But the actual final product is not under the Canadian. That's
Yeah.
very interesting.
yeah. So this is the thing that we need to understand as to why Canada doesn't have the domestic capability that the U.S. does, and people keep pointing to the UK. Well, they are using mostly the AstraZeneca one as opposed to the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines. We still haven't received approval for the AstraZeneca in Canada. There's been some issues around how the trials were conducted. So that's taking a longer time. They were able to scale up some of their domestic manufacturing in the UK to produce this the AstraZeneca vaccine domestically for themselves. So that's another thing is, they were further ahead in terms of scale up than we were in Canada. Back when this all started up in March of last year, the federal government started throwing money at companies in Canada who could possibly develop vaccines and who could start producing them. But that takes time, and increasing capacity for biomanufacturing is not an overnight process. It's going to take a year or two, sometimes 3. We're apparently managing in pretty good time for what is going to be able to come online, but it's not overnight. And I think there's this misconception that somehow we could be like World War II and change all of our industry overnight, and it doesn't work like that for biomanufacturing.
I mean, there were a certain number of, obviously elements is not the correct chemical term to use, but, there's iron, there's leather for boots. There are some specific ingredients to production of war materials in wars that are much more niche and broken down here. And I think that that's a very interesting insight into some of the language I've seen in the reporting around the Defense War Act concepts in the U.S., where you can kind of commandeer facilities to produce certain things as needed. But where do you think, because this is a very nuanced picture, and I think obviously I agree that it's a very accurate picture, and when you see reporting on these kind of statistics of Canada is 42nd in the world, and that's,
right.
For what it's worth, there are a lot of countries in the world, but also people expect Canada to be higher, let's be frank. And ratings do mean something. They have an impact on the public support of whatever government is happening. And when you look at the way that, I mean, Canada, at this point, I don't know if it's, I mean, I haven't checked recently, but it's about on par with the population of California.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just from the curious American's perspective, the distribution of vaccines in California, my home state, is confused and exhausting enough
Yeah.
that when you bring in, if you bring in a federal and provincial level split to that, whereas, obviously the governor of California has a lot more aggression and power over counties and districts in the state than the federal government has over provinces. And I think that's a really interesting question is, what is your perspective as, your history as a legal journalist, as a political journalist, and as a policy journalist of the responsibility of media when we draw these comparisons, and where are the mistakes that you're seeing?
Yeah.
Fallacies.
So going back to the rankings, again, it's not all apples to apples comparisons, because some of the, like, I was looking at one of the rankings today, and they're listing like Isle of Man and Jersey and Gibraltar as their own, as though they were separate countries and not.
I mean, I do feel like when one can cheer for the Isle of Man and when one can cheer for Gibraltar, good for them. But again, not so useful perhaps in the evaluation of vaccine rollout.
Yeah, I mean, those are I would have included those within their actual the countries that
jurisdiction.
Yeah,
Politics, yes.
yeah, and aside from that as well, a lot of the countries that are higher up in the rankings right now are getting their vaccines from Russia and China. And we don't have an idea yet as to whether those vaccines are as good as the vaccines that we have on the way are. So,
and then you added the statistical confusion around the fact that one thing I think that is being dramatically underreported, and as a curious American and as my friend, you're aware of how many different news outlets I follow. The efficacy of these vaccines, the sophistication of statistics needed to understand what actually is good and what is not, is way above even, I have to stretch myself a bit, and I've studied it formally, statistics.
yeah.
It's, given this shot, it might be less effective percentage-wise at preventing you catching COVID, but it is more effective at preventing hospitalizations from COVID.
Yeah.
These if this, then that elements of the statistics, I think, are deeply confusing to the public, and I think put an additional burden on the media world.
Yeah, and when they're trying for simple narratives of shots delivered, as opposed to, and trying to break that down or nuance that in any way, that's kind of where we kind of get in this kind of confusion, and I would say almost a certain amount of deliberate confusion in terms of muddying the water so that we look better or worse in comparison to other countries.
Well, I do feel like there is every country at a national news level has its own version of clickbait, right?
Yeah.
And for example, in the United States, I would say one of our clickbait elements is when there's some kind of poll or statistic that is the U.S. is hated more than X, or the U.S. is doing worse than X. It's a very big clickbait across the entire country, red, blue, and all between.
Yeah.
And in Canada, in my limited experience here, I'm almost ready for my Canadian citizenship. I'm almost qualified. But in the few years I've really lived here, I've really embraced engaging with the Canadian media and what it says, and a lot of what I feel is clickbait is either surprise praise or expected criticism.
Yeah, I mean, we've got this.
And I see that being dangerous with COVID.
Yeah,
it's a dangerous combination in terms of clickbait and COVID.
I mean, we've got these national neuroses around tall poppy syndrome at the same time as this inferiority complex from living next to the Americans. So,
which is natural, given you look at many other ecosystems of news. You've got the Belgians and the French and the Germans. You've got Pakistan, India, Afghanistan. It's a very natural thing when you have one heavy impact player in a region.
Yeah. And so I think that partially plays into it, and how our media kind of looks at how we're comparing ourselves, and I think part of that is this sort of inferiority complex, and part of it is also a certain amount of romanticization around the efficacy of American governments and this notion that, if they just put their minds to it, they can get stuff done. Whereas in Canada, we are somewhat mired in jurisdictional conflicts because we have so much more stronger constitutionally stronger provincial governments than state governments are in the U.S.
100%.
Yeah, and so this kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about kind of this notion about who's responsible for what, and in this case, the federal government was responsible for procuring it, and the provinces for rolling it out. And this is kind of played out as well in terms of like Ontario has been a bit of a gong show in terms of rolling it out, and where they couldn't even count the number of doses they had.
Is the population and the fact that Ontario is the most, from my understanding, the most populous province. How
Yeah.
much of it do you think is Ford and his government versus Ontario being like a flashpoint?
It's largely because the Ford government are full of incompetent murder clowns.
That's definitely an assessment that is clear, my friend. But given that, I'd love to extrapolate a bit more. So, given the Ontario situation,
yeah, it's just like they couldn't even count the number of doses they administered properly, and they've had counting errors reported 3 or 4 times now, and it's becoming farcical in terms of they keep demanding more doses, but they're not delivering the doses that they've got, and double counting them, and oops, we've only vaccinated half as many people as we thought we had.
I think the word you just used, farcical, is crucial to this entire conversation about the way, especially the latter half of this conversation, about the way that we're reporting on this in Canada versus the way the international news is picking up on it, there is, as I think is correct and legitimate, there's a very low tolerance for errors.
Mm-hmm.
There is something to be said of fine, you can criticize the government for not releasing numbers until they're sure because they should have been sure sooner. But when a government releases incorrect numbers in any capacity and then has to correct them, it is such a fundamental undermining of the public faith in the public health system.
Yeah.
Which for me, as a transplant to Canada, I've seen as a remarkable strength of this country that people listen to lockdown orders. I mean, in Ontario, in Ottawa, we're just now, after a month coming out of maybe to orange status, out of 7 different colors or whatever we're in. Quebec, which is just across the river, and my sister-in-law is there, they're under a curfew.
Yeah.
It makes you question the efficacy of the actual implementation of prevention, which is the danger zone.
Yeah, and partially it is because these governments have not taken it seriously enough in terms of instituting proper lockdowns, and then reopening before they've driven the numbers down far enough. Mm-hmm. And we're just going to go Ottawa's going back to orange, quote unquote, next week. That's going to last 3 weeks because the new variants are just going to rip through us because
they did cancel spring break for all of the high school students. So we'll see
they delayed it for a few weeks. They didn't cancel it.
They delayed it. I mean, I'm mindful of the time, but next time on this, my friend, I'm really curious to talk a bit more about how the management of the land border could be. We're going to have to do an extra segment.
We can do that.
Management of the land border, a little bonus for the Patreon peeps.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about that. Yeah, we can work on that.
The Patreoners might get an extra segment on the implementation of land border mitigations. I read today that it was 117 points of crossing.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and a lot of them are literally in the woods.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to discussing that with you. But this was really eye-opening, and I appreciate it. I think there's so much nuance. I mean, we all know statistics can be manipulated, but it has a very direct effect in a population population's fate in their own government's public health initiatives. And
Yeah.
I think we touched a bit on that in a deep way.
All right. And that is everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.